to welcome you to the second lecture in the History Week series sponsored by the Department of History at George Williams campus. Before introducing Professor Singer, who will introduce Professor Harrison, I have to, I suppose, do a little business. For one thing, I would like to invite you all, after the lecture and question period, to a reception in the faculty club on the 7th floor. There will be wine and good conversation, I hope. The easiest way to get to the faculty club from here, given the fact that by that time the cafeteria doors will probably be closed, is to use the elevator from this theater to the 7th floor. It's out the door, the exit, and to the right. I don't know if you'll all fit in the elevator at once, but hopefully they'll be possible to get most of you there intact. Also, I would like to just mention the lectures that are scheduled for the rest of this week. Professor Ramsey Cook of York University will be here tomorrow evening at this place at this time, speaking on the social and political ideas of the Canadian cartoonist J.W. Bengo, which will be an illustrated lecture. On Friday evening at this place and at this time, Professor Natalie Davis will be speaking on religion, family, and sex roles in early modern Europe. In addition to that, one more item of business before we begin. For those of you who are interested in the whole field of Chinese history, I would like to announce that a rather unusual program is being sponsored by the Department of History at St. George Williams, Concordia University. A course that would begin in January, January admission course on East Asia, China and Japan, which will meet every Saturday morning until the end of April, and then will take off for a 2-week stay in Tokyo and Kyoto, and then 2 more weeks in the People's Republic of China, Peking, and Shanghai. Those of you who are interested in this program should contact Ms. Mina Thaler in the continuing education department of George Williams campus of Concordia University. Now, I would like to introduce Professor Martin Singer, the Department of History, who will introduce Professor Harrison. Thank you.
This is actually a very strange moment. Professor Harrison was my first teacher of Chinese history 10 years ago. And thinking about it, I don't think I ever thought I'd be in this position introducing you. I don't know if he realized at the time how important he was being in steering me in the direction that he did, but certainly it was his first year or 2 of teaching himself out of having just gotten a PhD from Columbia University, and he was the most dynamic and inspiring teacher that I had in my years at Hunter College in New York. Since then, he has established himself very widely with 2 very important published works. The Communist and Chinese Peasant Rebellions, published in 1969, and one that many of you may be more familiar with, The Long March to Power, A History of the Chinese Communist Party. I know all my students, about 250 students over the last 3 years have read that. It is certainly the most authoritative Western interpretation of the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Since Professor Harrison won't, I will say that when I am asked, I usually regard it as one of the 3 or 4 books that should be read for people who wish an introduction to China. I don't want to give a long introduction, but I would like to say that we are hoping for an open question period, perhaps longer than usual at the end of the lecture. So, may I introduce Professor James Harrison of Hunter College of the City University of New York. Professor Harrison.
Thank you very much, Martin. If you don't like what I say, you can blame Martin, since he was a former student and is now the professor in residence here. I've chosen the title, The Chinese Revolution in Comparative Perspective, not because I know that much about the other great revolutions of modern times with which one might want to make comparisons, but rather because I think you cannot understand the Chinese Revolution unless you do see it in comparative perspective. One knows, of course, that each country and each revolution has its own characteristics, but similarly, of course, you cannot understand those characteristics unless you are comparing them with others. The easiest comparison to start with, of course, is to simply say the obvious fact that the Chinese Revolution was the greatest in size ever. That by the very fact, of course, of its huge population. But I think, and what I will mainly be trying to talk about, is to say that it also is certainly one of the most intense and compressed in history. Russia, of course, is a much bigger country, and hence its size in geographical scale was much larger. But the Russian revolutions of 1917 and the Civil War, which followed in the next few years, of course, dealt with many fewer people, and furthermore were more military battles, and the people did not get involved really in the revolutionary processes until after these essentially military battles had been won. The Vietnamese Revolution, having just one power in a military sense, has been more comparable to the Chinese Revolution in the sense that military and political struggles went hand in hand, and the Vietnamese Revolution, of course, was even longer than the Chinese one, some 30 years as against 22 years. However, Vietnam is about the size of one average Chinese province, say Phuket or Anhui, or in North American perspective, on the size of New Mexico. The Chinese communists, however, control considerable parts of at least 3 provinces, even before the Long March began, the Long March of 1934 and 5. And before that, certainly several million Chinese were directly involved in the Chinese Revolution. So actually to get statistics like that in terms of the numbers of people who were involved in the process, you really would do best to go into Chinese history itself, I think. And for example, the Great Taiping Rebellion, which when it took Nanking in 1853 had perhaps 1 million supporters. But so much is obvious. Let's go on to talk about some of the qualitative changes that have occurred in the Chinese Revolution. I mean, the first is obvious, of course, given the size of China, which is today reckoned at 800 million people and was on the order of 500 million people during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which decades are the ones that we'll be most concerned with here. And then I think the questioning probably will get more into the decades after the communists have come to power. But I think that the changes which have come to pass with the conquest of China by the Chinese communists have been as great or comparable in degree to those which occurred in what has been called, for example, the first revolution in history, which was from primitive society to settled agricultural villages and the origins of the first civilizations, and perhaps as large as, well, definitely as large as those in the Industrial Revolution, which, however, has taken, of course, several centuries in England, and at least many generations in most of the countries which are going through the Industrial Revolution. Whereas in China, what you have is the processes involved in the Industrial Revolution, political revolutions, intellectual revolutions, social revolutions, all of this going on in a very intense form and compressed in their most intense form into really several decades. So the life of people in the new China is, I think, as different from the life of people in the old China as would be the case if you take comparisons of that sort of our ancestors from ours. But the difference is that in the Western world, these changes have really come over the centuries, whereas in China it was all squeezed into a very small amount of time, and this in turn partly explains why there has been so much carnage in terms of the very large numbers of people killed in the Chinese Revolution. I do want to talk mostly about the intellectual aspects of the extraordinary changes which have come about in China. And before I do that, though, I should say a few things about some of the other most extraordinary achievements that have been made by the Chinese communists, to let you know that I do realize that there is a real China, since most of my talk will actually be rather abstract in terms of trying to talk about what drove the Chinese communists forward and also how they managed to organize this revolution against such enormous odds. First of all, the achievement of self-sufficiency in food is an obvious fact, but one which I think one has to start with. How do you go about feeding 800 million people in a country which is, has less arable land by far than the United States, let alone Canada? And of course, in previous times, these people were not fed. There were catastrophic famines periodically in Chinese history. One recent example was that in the late 1920s, it is said that 1/3 of one province of Shanxi, the one that the communists ended up in after the Long March, died of starvation. That was said to be 2.5 million people. In the great Yangtze floods of 1931, it is said that 25 million people were displaced, driven out of their homes. Another several million people died of starvation. There were some famines supposedly costing maybe even tens of millions of lives in the 19th century and earlier. By the way, there is the new Indian film Distant Thunder by the director Ray is to be recommended for trying to get a picture of how villagers, in this case India, survived or tried to survive and dealt with such catastrophes. That dealing with a village in Bengal before and during the famine of 1943 when 5 million people died. Well, the point is this kind of thing is, I think, simply unimaginable to us who do live in lands of plenty, in my case being an American, excuse me, even worse, from the United States. So the Chinese, having learned how to, of course, over the centuries for that matter, to feed an enormous number of people, but the communists, under the Communist Revolution, having organized these people so that there could be more food grown, number one, but also so it could be distributed widely enough so that people would not starve to death. This is certainly an extraordinary achievement. And from my recent 3-week trip there this past September, about 2 months ago, and for that matter, from my meal tonight, but which was also Chinese, I can say that Chinese food maintains its position as the world's tastiest, perhaps along with French, I should add, in Montreal. In industrial growth, the Chinese have also made extraordinary achievements. Whether they do, as they say they will, make China into a great and powerful socialist country by the end of this century, one certainly would tend to agree with Mao's statement of, he was quoted a few years ago as saying, the economic development of our country will be much faster than that of capitalism, which has reached its standard of prosperity only after several centuries. And certainly China is in a take off towards becoming a much, much stronger and richer country. One American economist, in an article I was just reading, projects that if China continues its growth rates of the last few decades, that by the year 2070, that is a century from when he was doing this work, it would have a gross national product probably 3 times that of the United States, some 3.3 billion. The population, of course, will continue to grow also, so that will mean that China, relatively speaking, assuming the rest of us are still alive, I mean, not as nations, that is, and don't destroy ourselves. As a civilization, China will still be relatively poor compared with the richer countries in a per capita sense. But unquestionably, China will be one of, if not the great economic power of the future. A final concrete point about real life in China, in quotes, would be something that you've also probably seen much about, but just to mention it, and again, because I was enormously impressed with this on my recent trip, namely healthcare. The fact that every village in China, commune that is, more appropriately today, and residential quarter of the great cities, and indeed factory, has its healthcare unit. I went to see a doctor just yesterday who was talking about something that, in this case, she had just read, namely that in the communes of China, a doctor's team had reported that the peasants were capable of sewing on fingers, that is, the peasants were. Of course, people who follow medical things would know that China did succeed in making some remarkable operations of this kind, of putting severed limbs back together on an injured person. But this particular doctor was saying that she had just read of a report that it was actually demonstrated, or in fact an accident occurred when a team of doctors were there, where the peasants actually knew exactly what to do in terms of putting the severed, in this case I think finger, back on the hand. There seems to have been an enormous breakthrough in the spreading of medical knowledge through China, and the making available through the barefoot doctors, through many other programs, medical care to the average person in China, so that I have the impression it would have been easier for me to tend to my recent minor problems in China than it has been in New York, which is perhaps not hard for you to imagine. But as I said, I want to talk mainly tonight about some more abstract matters to do with the Chinese Revolution, beginning with the thought processes which moved the founders of the Chinese Communist movement to take up the very bitter struggle that they did take up, and then go on from that to some more concrete discussion of the methods by which they achieved the organization of the Chinese Communist movement, and through which they won power and then went on to do the kinds of things that have had these results all along the line, from medicine to food to, of course, the H-bomb. In the last few years, there have been numerous campaigns against Confucianism, which dominate sort of journalistic treatment of what is going on in China in terms of intellectual life. But this, of course, has a history of at least 50 years in China. And indeed, what I like to call the first Cultural Revolution, which came during and after the World War I period, out of which actually grew or was founded the Chinese Communist movement. This first cultural movement, Cultural Revolution movement, was primarily concerned with attacking Confucianism. What Mao in the 1920s, Confucianism, and more specifically, or a few more specifics were put by Mao when he said in the 1920s that what we were trying to do was to destroy the 4 tyrannies of government, clan, superstition, meaning Confucianism in the sense of ideas, and for women, the 4th, that is, their husbands, and in and mothers-in-law. And this was called the Four Olds in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, the attack on old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. In short, an attack on virtually everything that existed in old China, except to try to say that the communists represented the good part of old China, which was the popular and revolutionary part of old China. But in terms of the, in quotes, old China that other people, and including me, when I'm using it this way, refer to, represented by Confucianism in thought and, of course, by the Mandarin class educated in Confucianism. In terms of the establishment, all of this was attacked, has been attacked in China from the First World War period. Now, it seems to me that the essence, and here getting to my first really main point, that the essence of this attack on Confucianism is a criticism of the central Confucian concept that a person must adapt and adjust to the situation in life in which he finds himself, which conception, for shorthand purposes, let's call harmony, a belief that the cardinal virtue is harmony. A person in society in dealing with his fellow man and man in general in terms of the universe, that he recognizes where his place is, he accepts and adjusts to that. A quotation from a leading Neo-Confucian of the 11th century would give some concrete idea of that. This man, named Chang'e, said, "If there is a thing, there must be a rule. The father rests in compassion, the son in filial piety, the ruler in benevolence, the minister in reverence. Each thing and every action has its proper place. If it gets it, there is peace. If it does not get it, there is disorder. The sage must make everything rest in its proper place." So this was the old Chinese idea. However, because of the defeats, especially because of the defeats by the Western powers in the Opium Wars, well, England, in the mid-19th century, by Japan in the 1890s, by virtually all of the great powers at the time of the Boxer movement, Chinese patriots came to understand that they were, in virtue, as they put it, of extinction and of going the way that Africa had gone, to become colonies of, split up into colonies of the leading powers of the world of the time. And Chinese progressive thinkers of the turn of the century, including the older members of those who went on to found the Chinese Communist Party, who in turn were the generation older than Mao Zedong, came to believe that the reason that China had gone from being first in the world, as it was, let's say 500 years ago. China, of course, thought of itself as the central kingdom. Zhongguo was the central kingdom of all under heaven. And how had China, which had been the central kingdom, sunk to the position of being pushed around, the pawn of the great powers? And progressive thinkers by the turn of the century came to the conclusion that the root cause was that the Chinese conceptions summarized in the quote I just mentioned, and which we could summarize in the idea that they should accept their lot, meant basically that China had been resting on its oars for 5 centuries, while the West had been going through, of course, the Renaissance and all that followed, the Enlightenment, the scientific and technological revolutions, and the Industrial Revolution, with the result that China, which had been unquestionably the strongest country on earth at the time of the great explorations of the Portuguese and Spanish and everything after that, but a few centuries later, China was in this hopeless position. So the thinkers of the time came to the conclusion, the progressives, that the reason must be that we have simply been resting on our oars. And as they looked further into what could be the secrets of Western success and strength, they came to the conclusion that it was because the West, which did in the late 19th century preach the doctrines of social Darwinism, had a very aggressive philosophy which was almost the opposite of the idea that you must accept your place in life and that a country even must accept its position. And the Western idea was, on the contrary, that as in Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. And how do the fittest survive? The fittest survive by struggle, and by struggling with their environment, by not accepting where they are, but by continually trying to get ahead, whether it's to keep up with the Joneses and to get a better house, but in a more general sense, it was, as in the famous quotation of Sir Edmund Hillary, why do you climb Mount Everest? Because it is there. The Western idea, which is certainly very arrogant in terms of comparative world history and did not appear until it appeared in the post-Renaissance West, that it was man's right and possibility to, in fact, conquer the world, in the sense that if something was there, man, meaning Western man in this sense, could get there, climb it. If it's Mount Everest, if it is a scientific problem, crack it by studying it. If it is a business, expand it. That this essential idea of going after things was really the root of Western strength, and the other side of the coin, the root of West Chinese weakness, was the opposite idea that they could sit back and simply have their harmonious position in the universe and in their particular society. Chun Shu, who in 1921 would be the real founder of the Chinese Communist Party, in 1915 founded a journal called Xin Qing Nian, or The New Youth. Actually, he subtitled it La Jeunesse Nouvelle, showing the years of his study in Paris. He said, I've called this the New Youth because I want our people to be young. And he quoted the expression that the Americans have the expression, Americans in English, he said, he could have said West in a larger sense, be young while you are old, whereas we Chinese have the opposite, and we say be old even while you are young. That is, we look up to our elders as being wise. We, as young people, accept where we are, and the opposite of that is the Western idea that you're always trying to be young and to struggle with your environment to improve it. He went on a year or so after that to go so far as to state that struggle and war are to society what movement is to the body. That is, that only through struggle, competition, can you become a strong society, in the same way that a body can only be strong through exercise. And then still a third quote from him to show you that the attack on Confucianism was already there. This is before 1921. Confucianism is incompatible with a new society and a new nation. And we must destroy it if we are to save China and to build up a new China. So this kind of revolution in thought, which was there, and indeed set the stage for the formation of the Chinese Communist Party, represents, I think, a very striking example of a really revolutionary step in the history of a particular people, in this case, of course, one quarter of the people on Earth. A recent communist leader's statement will give you also the idea that this idea that we must struggle continues down to the present. This communist leader said, our philosophy is the philosophy that emphasizes struggle. The principle of life for our party is that when there are contradictions, they must be struggled with. Struggle is the only way that we will be able to correct anything. Now, this adoption by the Chinese communists, by the person who would found the Chinese Communist movement, and of course he alone did not do that. There were thinkers from the late 1800s in the early 1900s who were progressing towards this extreme leap of faith, if you will, that Chun Shu took, which was to say that all of our past ways have actually been founded on a misconception which has enabled the rest of the world to pass us by. That is, in terms of philosophy, of course, the original Chinese idea was a very rich one. I needn't elaborate on that. But what I'm getting to here is that there is a paradox that indeed Western man now is coming more back to what, in these extreme generalizations, we could call the old Chinese idea or the old Asian idea, that indeed you must adjust to your environment and achieve harmony among your fellow men and in your universe, as against the rugged individualism that our ancestors, at least, emphasized earlier in our experience. So that we now come to the paradox that the people who push what really was originally a 19th century European idea, which was very aggressive towards the environment, the people who push this kind of idea most now are the Chinese communists, I think. And this is surely a great paradox. How could they do that? Of course, Mao's statement in 1949 that all other ways have been tried and failed is the reason that they could make such a huge jump as that. That is, the Chinese did become sufficiently embittered by their being pushed around by everyone that they came to this kind of extreme position and adopted this core idea that you could progress only through struggle. Now, it seems to me that in the other great modern revolutionary movements, you do not have this. It seems to me this is really goes so much farther in China as to become something that we could say perhaps was unique. In the French Revolution, way back in the late 1700s, of course, there also was an attack on the old ways of life, but this was an attack much more from within the French and the Western tradition. Actually, an interesting sort of aside on this is that, of course, some of the leading philosophers borrowed their examples also from abroad, from England particularly, and from Locke, but also from far-off China, which leading French thinkers cited as an example of how a government could do things for its people, keep good organization, and care for the people, and especially how it could be tolerant, unlike the Catholic Church of 18th century France, which was, of course, a prime object of attack in the French Enlightenment. So the French Enlightenment set up the French Revolution in the same way that perhaps the May 4th movement of 1919, what I call the first cultural revolution in China, sets up the Chinese Revolution. But the French Enlightenment, I think, could be argued, was much more within the French tradition. It is true that Plekhanov and Lenin and their followers in Russia were somewhat in the tradition of what we call the Westernizers, as against the Slavophiles, in 19th century Russian tradition. That is, the Slavophiles saying that we must build our revolution based on the Russian village and on Russian traditions, with Lenin in particular saying, no, that is nonsense because we are already becoming a capitalist nation and therefore we must adopt what were essentially radical thought inspired by at least the radical thought of France and Germany to turn Russia around so that they were Westernizers borrowing from the West. But certainly, as you know, of course, the Russian intelligentsia, alienated as they were mainly alienated from the establishment in Russia, but were themselves certainly much more of a part of the Western tradition certainly than was China, and had been educated for many generations in French and German, etc., as against the Chinese, who began making this jump towards adopting this aggressive Western philosophy at the turn of the century in China. So I'm suggesting that the intensity of the Chinese Revolution takes in part from the psychological tension involved in adopting a philosophy which was stressing, the core of which, or the essence of which, was stressing struggle, and the contrast of that with the traditional Chinese idea stressing that one must find one's harmonious position in society. Now, of course, I am actually somewhat overstating that because the Chinese Communist and presumably any Chinese group still operates with certain harmonies among the people involved. Even when the Chinese Communists are struggling with each other, they are perhaps still operating as Chinese in a certain sense or senses. So I'm perhaps overstating it when I say that what the Chinese Communists adopted via Leninism was completely foreign to China. But I think that this essential idea, which I argue is essential, that you progress through struggling with things by not sitting back and making one's adjustments to life, which I think was the core of traditional Chinese society, that this great jump between these two positions caused a great deal of tension, and that it partly explains some of the intensity of the Chinese Revolution. Now, the traumas of what the communists themselves more specifically had to go through with in the Chinese Revolution certainly must have seemed to confirm the notion that only the fittest can survive, and that to survive you must struggle, and struggle extremely fiercely once you have made the commitment to, in fact, side with, in this case, the Communist Revolution. The Chinese Communists were destroyed almost to the last man and woman almost twice. In 1927, when they were reduced from 58,000 members of the party down to under 10,000 by the end of that year, and then there were only 30 or 40,000 survivors, or perhaps even less, of the Long March from 1934, the last stragglers coming into North China to Shanxi in 1936. Now, how did the Chinese Communists survive this and everything that was thrown at them in between these two most dramatic episodes, when they were not only decimated, but rather 9 out of 10 were killed or driven out of the movement, as against 1 in 10. They did so because they had learned a second fundamental lesson. If we call this first absorbing of the idea of struggle through Leninism being the first lesson, they learned a second lesson where they go much beyond, went, I think, much beyond the Russians and the Russian Revolution, and the only other comparison really is what the Vietnamese communists achieved using the same second lesson, which was how to organize the villages, and it was mainly the villages, of course, after the Chinese communists were pushed out of, those who were not killed, out of Shanghai in 1927. And this technique for organizing the villages and later all of society is known as the mass line. In essence, the mass line was the recruitment of the activists first from the village. That meant the usually young, but certainly energetic and ambitious, usually young and usually radical by definition. If they were going to be listening to the communist agitators who would first come into the village, these agitators would then recruit some activist who might not be more than a small percentage of the village, but that is the people who did recognize that things had to be turned upside down in that village and ultimately in all of China, if China was to be saved. And then using these new local recruits, through them to reach the masses of that village, to organize mass meetings, to, if necessary, call on the Red Army and force, if necessary, to make this stick, and to have trials to bring to justice people who, according to the communists, were the counter-revolutionaries, or anyway, people who could be who were judged to be stopping things being turned around in that particular village. And let me read you a couple of quotes about this. First of all, another recent communist summary of description of what they had achieved. The peasant question was the central question in our democratic revolution. The party, therefore, went deep into the villages for 22 years to lead the armed revolutionary struggle which used the village to encircle the cities. What the party adopted was the mass line policy of resolutely relying on the peasants' political consciousness and organized strength, mobilizing the peasants to save themselves. This enabled the party to build powerful bastions in the rural areas, to build up the revolutionary army and revolutionary base, and gradually raise the enthusiasm and discipline of the masses of peasants close to the level of the revolutionary proletariat. That sentence, of course, is in terms of Marxist theory, where the proletariat is, of course, supposed to be the really revolutionary class, but the Chinese peasantry being raised close to that, and receive from them the continuous supply of manpower and material reserves needed by the party and the People's Army led by the party. The official statement was made, description of the mass line, constantly quoted in China, was made by Mao in 1943, and was a shorter one, saying, "In all practical work of our party, correct leadership can only be developed on the principle of from the masses to the masses. This means summing up, i.e. coordinating and systematizing after careful study the views of the masses, and taking these back to the masses, explaining them and popularizing them until the masses embrace these ideas as their own." This being the key sentence there. To take back what was an abstruse conceptions of Marxism, Leninism, learning how to popularize this in terms of being able to talk, of course, to the peasants, the activists, and then the masses in general, and being able to get feedback from them to resort this and once more take it back until the masses embrace these ideas as their own, stand up for them, and translate them into action, even to the point of dying for the revolution, which of course they did literally by the millions. Mao in 1933, one final short thing, gives a few more specifics. We must mobilize the masses of a given village by holding numerous meetings to explain the classes, and thereby finding out who are the activists and educate these activists, and through the activists come into close contact with the local masses, and then to develop the Poor Peasant Corps, the women's organizations, the other mass organizations, and to unfold the class struggle. In places where the situation is especially serious and reactionary elements are standing in the way of the struggle, these reactionary elements must be captured, tried, sentenced in public meetings, and if necessary, shot with the consent of the masses. So the Chinese communists, after the disasters of 1927, the few thousand survivors of these disasters, went on to work out a technique through which they were able to explain the ideas of Marxism, Leninism, and the core concept even that I was talking about earlier, in such a way that they could get the peasants, most of them of course illiterate, to understand this and to say, yes, perhaps you are right, and to get them, maybe most crucially of all, actually involved in the process of having them speak up at public meetings, of bringing people to trial, and in short, create what comes to be called by political science just a infrastructure literally from the family up to all organizations of the Communist Party in this case. So with this, the Chinese communists succeeded in building back to maybe 100,000 core people by 1930, that is in 2 years, mainly 1929 and 1930, to perhaps 300,000 core people. You get all kinds of variants of figures because, of course, you have the figures for the party and the figures for the army, and there's some overlap. But so when I say core people, I mean the activists who are really drawn into the primary communist organizations. Based on that, they were able to survive the first 4 encircle and destroy campaigns that the nationalists threw at them. Japan, meanwhile, had invaded Manchuria in 1931. However, by 1933, the communists were quite strong. The Japanese were pushing south from Manchuria. Chiang Kai-shek was trying to destroy the communists, saying that once he had done that, he would then try to deal with Japan. When, however, Chiang Kai-shek was able to stall Japan long enough to launch still another effort, the so-called 5th extermination campaign in winter of 33 and 4, which closed the net around the several hundred, now reduced to say several 100,000 core people in Jiangxi, south of the Yangtze River, forcing them to go on the long march, actually about 100,000 or so leaving, another 50,000 or so already being north of the Yangtze River in Sichuan province. Then, however, of course, the Long March was obviously a great and traumatic experience, which reduced the communists once more down to about 1 in 10 in terms of what they had been a few years before. Then Japan invaded China outright, that is south of Peking, from July of 1937. And the Chinese communists were able to expand behind the Japanese lines in North China, and using the techniques of the mass line to build more rapidly than a revolutionary movement ever built in history to 1 million strong by 1940, to about 1.5 million by 1945, to maybe 5 million core people in 1949, which was already considerably more than the nationalists ever had, even though the nationalists had, of course, all of the apparatus of the state government and some foreign aid, etc. So the Chinese communists, using these 2 lessons that I've mentioned, and of course much else goes into this, succeeded in winning power in 1949, but I especially want to stress the mass line as being their real secret weapon of how they were able to survive everything that was thrown at them and to keep coming back and to go on to win power. Now, this is in terms of the revolutionary struggle for power. When one speaks of the Chinese Revolution, of course, it also involves the economy, the society, all of that. Some of this naturally was still going on. In terms of education, more and more Chinese were becoming literate. There were some advances being made in the economy, greater advances in communications, and other such things. The result then was that when the Chinese communists took power in 1949, they had already, by now, a substantial number of core activists. They had learned great lessons. They had enormously capable people working for them, and China was ripe for takeoff in the sense of a country with a long and proud past, which had gone through its horrors of the previous 100 years, and therefore has been leaping ahead since then. You will have read much more about the revolution since 1949, and therefore I'm not going to say anything more about that here, except reminding you of some of the generalizations I made at the beginning. And we'll be very glad to have discussion about what has happened since 49. But in conclusion, would just like to once more restate that the 2 main ideas, the adoption of what was an essentially European idea of that you should have an aggressive outlook on life, number 1. Number 2, I should add a bit to what I said before about it, took much more from the Chinese tradition, because, of course, old China was the most organized old society on earth. The Chinese dynasties having relatively much larger bureaucracies than their equivalents elsewhere had, and opposing the Chinese dynasties, the Chinese peasant rebellions had also much larger numbers of people in the peasant revolts of Chinese history. So the Chinese, in short, knew how to organize in a way. But the Chinese communists, after 1927, using also other techniques from Leninism, from the Russian experience and more indirectly from the European experience, put all of this together to create the mass line to turn China upside down. And I think the same mass line in Vietnam, of course, is dramatized to the world, or should have, and yet no one seems to understand that. I mean, no one in terms of, let's say, if you hear a United States State Department spokesman talking about the lessons of the Vietnam War, you'll probably never hear anyone say, well, in fact, the communists were the only ones who knew how to organize, and we didn't know how to do that, and we don't know how or why. This difference, no one seems to, or few people seem to get that, but anyway, my final point is to stress the importance of this. And in China, the communists took power and proceeded to transform the face of China based on that. Thank you.
If there are any questions, we ask that you come to one of the two microphones that are in the aisles. Okay.
Why don't you ask the first question? It doesn't have to be a question. It can also be a correction or a commentary or a...
I think the way to proceed, since I know that people will lose their shyness fast, is that you should you don't have to raise your hand or anything. Just come to the microphone at the point at which you're ready and wait until your turn comes up. Yes.
You made the comment about the revolution being so very compressed and brief and intense in China compared to previous revolutions, and made the comment that what happened before and after the revolution is comparable to changes over centuries in the Western world. Is there no sector of the Chinese economy, no province? Are there no people who are still more or less living the same kind of life they lived, in 1920 odd, where, as far as the day-to-day life is concerned, they seem to have much the same kind of lifestyle?
Yes, of course, you're right, and yet I am also right. And I think the point is that I was overstating it to make my points, but I think that still it is faster. You could similarly say that if you go into a French village, that the peasant there is also not living that differently from the way he lived 500 years before. He may look at television every now and then in the town hall or whatever. But this is also happening in China. We were on a fish farm outside of Changsha where they had a television set which was on, taking television from Changsha. So you still, of course, you see the people with the water buckets slung over each shoulders and many things that have been the same for centuries. But I think still it is transforming very, very rapidly. And I stress the idea part of it in a way because I think that is the thing which maybe has changed fastest if one wants to compare it with, let's say, changes in England or France from the Middle Ages. That in thought the changes have been even more rapid, which is not to say that some ways of thinking are not very, in quotes, very Chinese, which was, of course, said about Mao Zedong himself, obviously, who was always quoting the Chinese classics, etc. But it seems to me that the essential content of what they're saying is extraordinarily different from the essential content of, let's say, the average quotation from 1900. And I think that is extraordinarily compressed. Yes.
From your years of studying in the United States about China, and then finally getting to visit China this September, which of your preconceived notions about China was most shattered, if any?
Very difficult question. difficult on several levels. I think, let me talk a bit and then try to come back more precisely to your question. I think that most of what I've read in, say, 2 decades of intensive readings about China was not wrong. But going to China brings it alive. This, of course, is what you would expect. But all kinds of anecdotes that I've heard from Chinese friends and or old Chinese hands, Westerners who had lived there, I would then see a modern equivalent of this, such as what I just mentioned, the peasants carrying the water buckets, which one hears about such things in village Asia, and then to see the green of the rice fields brings alive Fairbanks' famous opening page about crossing from brown North China to green South China. To see this kind of thing transforms it somewhat. I think I was most impressed by, again, a matter of what you have read about, but to see this incredible enthusiasm, which you can't quite believe when you read about it, but when you're there, you do seem to believe it. In the sense of tens of millions of people. I mean, of course, what you see is presumably thousands, but they're crowded in a place like Shanghai and Peking and other cities to the extent that you can believe the huge size of the population. To see them bustling about, you get the feeling that, my goodness, I've read this somewhere, was it Marco Polo? You know, talking about the streets of Hangzhou in the late 1200s, of how the Chinese were always bustling about. So then you see that, and of course that brings it alive. But to see there, of course, I'm saying that maybe the Chinese have always been an enthusiastic people, and that is true. That is something that the Chinese Revolution has not changed. On that point, I would say that the communists have unleashed the enthusiasms of the Chinese people, and this was enormously impressive to see some examples of how this was unleashed. Now let me try to get more specific back to your question. What did I find that was most different and most like what I expected?
Well, most jarring to your whole approach towards things.
Well, in terms of what was most jarring to my whole approach towards China, I would say nothing. That is, I can certainly would say that as a bourgeois Westerner, I would find it a leap on my part to get into such a society where I was organized to that extent that I would spontaneously and with guidance or whatever be wanting to discuss Shakespeare twice a week, or whatever our equivalent would be of the present discussions of the criticisms of the novel translated as All the Men Are Brothers, or the Water Margin, Shui Hu Chuan, which is the latest campaign, is to criticize the capitulationism of the peasant rebel, formerly hero of that novel, who in fact, however, accepted a government position and proceeded to try to exterminate another peasant rebel. And so the communist leaders have picked on this as an example known to in Chinese popular literature to dramatize what they mean by capitulationism. That is perhaps a bit jarring, and yet to the sensibilities of a bourgeois Westerner. And yet you have to recognize that the way in which they have turned around China must be based on precisely that kind of organization and thought revolution. So, in short, I was not that surprised. I was really very impressed with what they are doing. I think is, enormously impressive for China, but with the only qualification that being that I'm not sure exactly where I would fit into that. Well, I know I wouldn't. Short of some revolution on my part.
Anything comparable to strong dissent or disenchantment with the system emerged? Have they produced a GLAS in the last few years? And if so, what happens to the deviance within a system that has the truth?
Now this...
changing undoubtedly, but
yes,
somehow going
right.
on.
This is another good question. First, number one, China did not have a tradition of dissent of an intellectual sort. Maybe Martin and others would quarrel with that. I myself might quarrel with it. But compared certainly with the West, it did not. Compared with Russia, it did not. There were, of course, Chinese iconoclasts through the centuries as against the dominant people who accepted state Confucianism. So there was some idea of dissent, but I don't think it was, and there was the whole censorial tradition of censoring even the emperor. So that is, in a way, just giving background. To come down to the present, there have to be, nonetheless, people who do say, in fact, I was told that by a student who was one of those who had been assigned to a commune who had gotten to Hong Kong. She said, yes, they are doing great things, but I couldn't stand it. And because she was a person who, for whatever reasons, and I didn't